The rain fell in merciless sheets upon the cobblestones of Mayfair, turning the streets into rivers of cold, unforgiving gray. Lady Georgiana Hartley, once the toast of society, now stripped of title and inheritance by a vindictive cousin, pressed her shoulder against the servants' entrance of Thornwell House, her sodden cloak clinging to her like a shroud. Her fingers, raw and reddened from scrubbing floors in a dozen households, trembled as she clutched the forged reference letter that had secured her this position. She had sworn upon her father's grave that she would reclaim what was stolen, but first she must survive. Inside the grand foyer, oblivious to the tempest without, stood the Duke of Thornwell, Dominic Grayson, a man whose wealth could buy parliaments and whose temper could ruin reputations with a single word. His jaw was set in a hard line as he surveyed the disarray of his study, where priceless books lay scattered like fallen soldiers. A maid, some nameless, faceless girl, had dared to disturb his sanctuary. "Clean this mess," he spat, his voice a blade of contempt. "And if I find so much as a page out of place, you will be dismissed without reference." The woman before him, drenched, trembling, yet with eyes that burned like sapphires in firelight, did not cower. "As you wish, your Grace," she said, her voice low and steady, though her heart beat a savage rhythm of fury and fear. He did not know that the maid he had just commanded was in truth the rightful Duchess of Courtyard, a woman who had once danced in these very halls as his equal. Georgiana had been raised in privilege, groomed for power. At 18, she had inherited the Duchy of Courtyard upon her father's death, a rare honor for a woman, granted by royal decree due to her father's service to the crown. She had been clever, capable, and beloved by her tenants. But her cousin, Lord Percival Hartley, had schemed and forged documents to contest her claim. Without allies or funds to fight him in court, Georgiana had been cast out, her title stripped, her inheritance seized. Rather than retreat to the countryside in shame, she had done the unthinkable. She had assumed a false identity and entered domestic service. Her plan was audacious: work her way into the households of the powerful, gather intelligence, and find evidence of Percival's treachery. She had spent 6 months moving from house to house, her ears open, her pride swallowed. Now she had secured a position at Thornwell House. The Duke of Thornwell was one of the most influential men in England, a known associate of her cousin. If anyone possessed the leverage to destroy Percival, it was him. But she had not anticipated the Duke himself. Dominic had inherited his title at 16 when his father died in a hunting accident. He had learned swiftly and brutally that power was currency and that trust was a weakness. His mother had remarried within a year, abandoning him to a cold, empty estate. His closest friend had betrayed him in a business venture that nearly bankrupted the dukedom. Since then, Dominic had built walls of ice around his heart, conducting his affairs with ruthless efficiency and keeping the world at arm's length.
He was not cruel by nature, but he had no patience for incompetence or for sentiment. His household ran like clockwork, and he expected absolute obedience from his servants. To him, they were invisible cogs in a machine, necessary but unremarkable. Until tonight. The new maid, Mrs. Gray, according to the housekeeper, had been caught in the rain and arrived late. He had been in a foul temper already, having discovered that his study had been tidied by an overzealous chambermaid who had disrupted years of careful organization. When he saw the bedraggled woman in the doorway, he had not bothered to temper his fury. But when she met his gaze, steady, unflinching, defiant, something stirred in the frozen depths of his chest, a flicker of recognition, though he could not place her face, a sense that this woman was not what she seemed. He dismissed the feeling. She was a servant, nothing more. Over the following days, Georgiana worked with meticulous care, her mind always calculating. She learned the rhythms of the household, the Duke's habits, the whispers of the other servants. She discovered that Dominic kept meticulous records in his study, records that might contain proof of her cousin's crimes. But gaining access would require proximity, and proximity to the Duke was dangerous. Dominic, meanwhile, found himself increasingly unsettled by the new maid. She moved through his home with a grace that belied her station, and her voice, when she spoke, carried an education that no servant should possess. He began to watch her, suspicion prickling at the edges of his mind. One evening, he found her in his study, a ledger in her hands. Their eyes met, and in that instant, the carefully constructed lies between them began to crack. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low and lethal.
Georgiana lifted her chin, her heart pounding. She could run, she could lie, or she could gamble everything on the truth. "I am the woman you should have bowed to," she said quietly, "before my world was stolen." The ledger fell from Georgiana's hands, striking the Persian carpet with a muffled thud. The Duke of Thornwell stood in the doorway, his tall frame blocking her only escape. At 32, Dominic Grayson was a portrait of masculine severity. Dark hair swept back from a broad forehead, gray eyes sharp as winter frost, shoulders broad beneath his tailored black coat. His jaw worked with barely restrained fury. "The woman I should have bowed to?" he repeated, advancing into the room. Candlelight carved shadows beneath his cheekbones. "You speak in riddles, Mrs. Gray, if that is even your name." Georgiana straightened to her full height, though at 24 and slight of build, she barely reached his shoulder. Her maid's dress of gray wool hung shapeless on her frame, but her posture belonged to a duchess. "My name is Lady Georgiana Hartley. I am, or was, the Duchess of Courtyard, before my inheritance was stolen by treachery and forgery." His eyes narrowed. "Courtyard, that title belongs to Lord Percival Hartley." "It belongs to me by blood and by law," she said, her voice steady despite the wild hammering of her pulse, "and I can prove it if you will listen." Dominic studied her face, the high cheekbones, the sapphire eyes, the determined set of her mouth. Recognition flickered. He had seen her once, years ago, at court. "You have 5 minutes," he said coldly. "Speak quickly."
Georgiana spoke rapidly, laying bare the circumstances of her father's death, the contested will, the forged documents that declared her incompetent to hold the duchy. She explained how Percival had bribed magistrates and silenced witnesses, leaving her without recourse. "I spent my last shillings on the journey to London," she said, her hands clasped tightly before her. "I sought positions in households where Percival conducts business. I need evidence, correspondence, contracts, anything that proves his deception." Dominic crossed to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Rain streaked the glass like tears. "Lord Percival Hartley invested heavily in my shipping company last year," he said slowly. "If your accusations are true, our association makes me complicit." "Then help me expose him," Georgiana urged, stepping forward. "You have access to documents I could never reach. You have influence." "I have a reputation," he interrupted sharply, turning to face her. "Do you comprehend what you are asking? To accuse a peer of the realm without irrefutable proof would destroy us both." Their eyes locked. In the charged silence, Georgiana saw calculation warring with something deeper in his expression, perhaps a buried memory of his own betrayals. "Then help me find proof," she whispered. "Please." The word hung between them like a prayer. Finally, Dominic nodded once. "Very well, Lady Georgiana, but if you deceive me, I will see you transported."
The following morning, Georgiana was summoned to the Duke's private study. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating shelves crammed with leather-bound volumes and maritime charts. Dominic sat behind a mahogany desk, dressed in a charcoal waistcoat and crisp white shirt, his cravat knotted with mathematical precision.
"Sit," he commanded, gesturing to the chair opposite. She obeyed, acutely aware of her borrowed servant's dress, her unadorned hair twisted into a simple knot. He regarded her with cool assessment, as though she were a ledger requiring auditing. "If we are to work together, there must be rules," he began. "First, you will continue as my housekeeper's assistant. Your true identity remains concealed, even from my staff. Second, you will report your findings to me alone. Third," he paused, his gaze sharpening, "you will obey my instructions without question. I will not tolerate rebellion under my own roof." Georgiana's chin lifted. "I am not a child to be commanded, Your Grace. I am a duchess in exile." "You are a woman without title, fortune, or protection," he countered, his voice dangerously soft. "I offer you both shelter and assistance. In return, I require your cooperation." Their wills clashed across the polished desk like swords meeting. "I agree to your first two conditions," Georgiana said finally, "but I will not surrender my judgment. If your instructions are unwise, I will say so." His mouth curved, not quite a smile. How refreshingly insolent. That evening, Dominic hosted a small supper for several business associates, including Lord Percival Hartley. Georgiana watched from the servants' corridor as guests arrived in gleaming carriages. Her cousin emerged in a plum-colored coat, his rounded belly straining against embroidered buttons, his jowls quivering as he laughed too loudly at his own jest. Rage, white-hot and blinding, surged through her veins. This man had stolen everything, her birthright, her dignity, her future. He dined in splendor while she scrubbed floors. But vengeance required patience. She slipped into Dominic's study while the men dined, searching through correspondence with meticulous care. Most letters concerned shipping schedules and trade contracts. Then, wedged behind a stack of invoices, she found it, a note in Percival's hand referencing the Courtyard matter and suggesting a payment to a magistrate named Holbrook. Her heart thundered. This was not proof, not yet, but it was a thread. Footsteps sounded in the corridor. Panic seized her. She shoved the letter into her bodice and dove behind the heavy velvet curtains just as the door opened. Dominic entered, accompanied by another gentleman. "The shipping routes must be secured before autumn storms," he was saying. Georgiana pressed herself flat against the cold window glass, scarcely daring to breathe. Would he discover her? And if he did, would he believe she had found something, or assume she was betraying him? The men departed after several agonizing minutes. Georgiana emerged from her hiding place, only to find Dominic standing motionless in the center of the room, his eyes fixed upon her with glacial intensity. "I can explain," she began. "You were meant to wait for my signal," he said, his voice laced with ice. "Instead, you risked exposing us both. What possessed you to such recklessness?" She withdrew the letter from her bodice, her hand trembling with equal parts fear and triumph. "I found this. Percival references paying Magistrate Holbrook, the same man who declared me incompetent to inherit. It proves collusion." Dominic snatched the paper, scanning its contents. His expression darkened. "This proves nothing in a court of law. It is merely suggestive." "Then we find more," Georgiana insisted, stepping closer. "Holbrook's records, bank transactions, witness testimony."
"You do not command here," Dominic interrupted, his tone sharp as broken glass. "I agreed to help you, not to let you dictate strategy. Another reckless move, and I will withdraw my support entirely." Her eyes blazed. "You speak of strategy while I speak of survival. Every day Percival remains unchallenged, my claim grows weaker. Every day I scrub your floors in disguise, I lose more of myself." The raw anguish in her voice struck him silent. He saw, for the first time, the true cost of her ordeal. The proud Duchess forced into servitude, the brilliant mind reduced to subterfuge. "You will not lose yourself," he said quietly, "not while I draw breath." A fortnight later, London society prepared for the Marquis of Halford's grand masquerade ball. Dominic received his invitation with customary indifference, but Georgiana saw opportunity. "Percival will attend," she said, cornering the Duke in his library. "Half of London's elite will be masked. I could move among them, listen to conversations, perhaps even search Percival's carriage." "Absolutely not," Dominic replied, not lifting his eyes from the contract he was reviewing. "You lack an invitation, appropriate attire, and any plausible excuse for attendance. Then secure me an invitation. Present me as a distant cousin visiting from the country. No one will recognize me behind a mask." He set down his quill with deliberate slowness, finally meeting her gaze. "You are remarkably persistent." "I am desperate," she corrected. "There is a difference." Something in her unflinching honesty moved him. Perhaps it was the echo of his own youthful determination before betrayal had hardened him into cynicism. Or perhaps it was the dangerous realization that her presence in his home had begun to matter more than mere alliance demanded.
"Very well," he conceded, "but you will remain at my side throughout the evening. You will take no independent action, and if I sense danger, we depart immediately. Agreed?" Georgiana's face illuminated with triumph. Agreed. Neither acknowledged the deeper current flowing beneath their words, the growing pull between guardian and ward, between Duke and Duchess, between two wounded souls finding unexpected solace. On the evening of the masquerade, Georgiana stood before the mirror in her borrowed chamber, scarcely recognizing her own reflection. Dominic's sister, who resided in Bath, had unknowingly provided the gown, a creation of midnight blue silk that clung to Georgiana's slender frame before cascading to the floor in shimmering waves. Her honey-colored hair had been dressed high, threaded with sapphire ribbons, and a silver filigree mask concealed the upper half of her face. She looked like the Duchess she had been born to be. A knock sounded. She opened the door to find Dominic in full evening attire, black tailcoat, dove-gray waistcoat, snowy cravat pinned with a sapphire stick-pin. His mask was simple black leather, but it somehow made him more imposing, more mysterious. His eyes traveled over her with an intensity that made heat bloom in her cheeks. "You look—" He paused, as though the appropriate words escaped him. "You look precisely as you should." "As a duchess?" she asked softly. "As yourself," he corrected. The carriage ride to Halford House passed in charged silence. Georgiana was acutely conscious of Dominic's presence beside her, the warmth radiating from his body, the subtle scent of sandalwood and leather, the way his knee occasionally brushed hers when the carriage swayed. When they arrived, he handed her down with aristocratic courtesy, his gloved fingers closing around hers.
"Remember," he murmured, leaning close enough that his breath stirred the tendrils at her temple, "you do not leave my sight." "I remember," she whispered back, though whether she would obey remained uncertain. Halford House blazed with 1,000 candles, their light refracting through crystal chandeliers and striking sparks from jewels adorning masked ladies. Music swelled from the ballroom, violins weaving intricate melodies while couples whirled across polished marble. Georgiana's fingers tightened on Dominic's arm as they entered. Somewhere in this glittering crowd was Percival. Somewhere was the truth she sought. "You are trembling," Dominic observed. "With anticipation," she replied. though fear played no small part. They moved through the crowd, Dominic greeting acquaintances with cool civility, while Georgiana's eyes searched every face. Then, there, Percival stood near the refreshment table, his bulk draped in expensive silk, laughing with a thin gentleman in a crimson mask. "The man with him," Georgiana breathed. "That is Magistrate Holbrook." Dominic's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, a gesture both protective and restraining. "Steady." The orchestra struck up a waltz. Dominic turned to her, extending his hand. "Dance with me. It will draw less attention than staring." She accepted, and he swept her onto the floor. His right hand settled at her waist, his left cradling her gloved fingers, and they began to move in perfect synchrony. Georgiana had waltzed countless times as a duchess, but never had she felt so utterly consumed by her partner's proximity. "You dance well," he murmured. "As do you," she managed, though coherent thought was rapidly becoming impossible. Over his shoulder she watched Percival and Holbrook retreat toward a private corridor. This was her chance, perhaps her only chance.
"I must follow them," she said urgently. Dominic's grip tightened. "No." "Please." "No." But Georgiana had not survived 6 months of degradation by accepting refusal. The music crescendoed. Georgiana executed a graceful turn, then deliberately stumbled, crying out softly. Concerned guests turned. In the moment of confusion, she slipped from Dominic's grasp and disappeared into the crowd. She heard him call her name, her real name, but did not stop. The corridor Percival and Holbrook had entered stretched, dark and quiet, lit only by occasional wall sconces. She followed the murmur of voices to a closed door, pressing her ear against the wood. "You cannot continue paying these amounts," Percival was saying, his voice petulant. "The Cortland estates generate substantial income, but liquidating assets draws attention." "Nevertheless, our arrangement requires compensation," Holbrook replied coldly. "I falsified legal documents, perjured myself before the crown. Should the truth emerge, we both hang." Georgiana's pulse roared in her ears. This was it, confession of conspiracy. Behind her, a footstep creaked. She whirled to find Dominic materializing from the shadows, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. He seized her wrist, pulling her away from the door and into an alcove shrouded by heavy tapestries. "Are you utterly mad?" he hissed, his voice low and lethal. "What if they had discovered you?" "They confessed," she whispered urgently. "I heard them confess conspiracy, forgery, perjury." "And what use is that?" he demanded. "Your word against theirs? A disgraced woman's accusations?" Tears of frustration burned her eyes. "Then what would you have me do? Accept defeat? Abandon my birthright?" His hands framed her face, forcing her to meet his gaze. "I would have you trust me," he said, his voice rough with something she could not name. "I would have you safe." The world narrowed to the space between them, the warmth of his palms against her cheeks, the silver intensity of his eyes behind his mask, the thunderous beating of her own heart. Georgiana saw past his walls in that moment, glimpsing the lonely boy who had learned too young that trust was currency and love a weapon. "I do trust you," she whispered, "but I cannot be merely safe. I must be whole." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, a touch so tender it stole her breath. "You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever encountered," he said hoarsely. "Brave and brilliant and utterly infuriating. You make me want to believe that not everyone betrays, that some things are worth fighting for beyond wealth and power." "What things?" she breathed. "This," he said, and kissed her. His mouth claimed hers with a hunger that spoke of months of denial, of propriety finally shattered, of two souls recognizing their mirror.
Georgiana's hands fisted in his coat, pulling him closer, answering his passion with her own desperate need. The kiss was not gentle, it was storm and fire, rebellion and surrender, everything they could not say given voice through touch. When they finally broke apart, both struggling for composure, footsteps sounded in the corridor. "Someone comes," Dominic said urgently. "We must return before—" "Well, well," drawled a familiar, hateful voice. "What have we here?" Percival Hartley stood at the corridor's entrance, his eyes glittering with malicious triumph behind his mask. Percival's lips curled into a serpent's smile as he stepped closer, his bulk blocking their escape. "My dear cousin," he said, savoring each word like poisoned wine, "I had heard rumors of your reduced circumstances, but consorting the Duke of Thornwell in darkened corridors? How thoroughly you have fallen." Georgiana's blood turned to ice, but she lifted her chin with the hauteur of her birthright. "You know nothing of falling, Percival, only of pushing others." "Such spirit," he mocked, then turned his gaze to Dominic. "Your Grace, I must express my shock at finding you in such compromising company. Does society know you harbor thieves and impostors beneath your roof?" Dominic's hand found Georgiana's, his fingers interlacing with hers, a public claim, a declaration of alliance. "Mind your tongue, Hartley," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You are speaking of a lady." "A lady!" Percival's laughter echoed off the stone walls. "She is a servant, a pretender, a woman declared unfit to manage her own affairs, let alone a duchy." He leaned forward, his breath reeking of brandy and malice. "And now I have witnessed her seducing one of England's most prominent peers. What do you suppose the scandal sheets will pay for such delicious intelligence?" The threat hung in the perfumed air like a blade. But Georgiana had not come this far to crumble now. She stepped forward, her sapphire eyes blazing behind her mask. "Go ahead, cousin, expose me, but ask yourself what else might be exposed in the telling. What other secrets might come tumbling out when investigators begin asking questions about falsified documents and purchased magistrates?" Percival's face purpled, but before he could respond, Dominic spoke, his aristocratic drawl cutting like Sheffield steel. "I suggest, Lord Hartley, that you return to the ballroom. This conversation serves no one's interests, least of all your own." For a long, terrible moment, the three stood locked in silent combat. Then Percival stepped back, adjusting his coat with false nonchalance. "This is not finished," he hissed, "not by half." He disappeared into the shadows, leaving Georgiana trembling with reaction. Dominic drew her into his arms, his embrace both shelter and fortress. "He will destroy us both now," she whispered against his chest. "Then we shall destroy him first," Dominic replied, his voice resonating with iron determination. "Together." And in that moment, Georgiana understood that she had found something more precious than her stolen inheritance. She had found an ally who would stand beside her when the whole world fell away. But the battle had only just begun. What do you think happens next? Will Georgiana and Dominic find the evidence they need before Percival strikes? Can love truly bloom between a fallen duchess and a guarded duke? Or will their growing connection become their greatest vulnerability? And what devastating price might Percival demand to keep their secret? Or will they turn the tables and expose his treachery first? Part 2 drops tomorrow. If you're watching this after 24 hours, check the pinned comment for the link to Part 2. You won't want to miss what happens when Percival makes his move and Georgiana must choose between reclaiming her title and protecting the man she's coming to love. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an update to this story. And please share this with anyone who loves tales of romance, revenge, and resilience. Your support means everything and helps us bring you more stories like this one. Until tomorrow, the rain still falls on Mayfair, and destinies hang in the balance.